Oh, well, good morning, everyone, once again. Good morning. This morning, I am speaking on the common good. The common good. I've thought about this term for a long time, and you could define the common good as a concern for the life of all beings. The idea of the common good is expressed really quite well in the teaching to love our neighbors as ourselves. I've always loved the St. Augustine quote where he said, "The measure of love is to love without measure." The measure of love is to love without measure. If we have been lucky in life, we may have had the mystical experience of truly feeling oneness with all life. You know, we've all, I think, had moments, some of us maybe long moments, where we felt so close to our beloved that we felt as one, not two. Or perhaps we've gone so deep into the silence that we experience ourselves as one vast infinite being, all inclusive, nothing outside of ourselves. And so a desire for the common good or for the good of all, it's very natural when we're in the state of oneness. It's very natural. It's like, you know, everything is part of our body and we love our toes as much as we love our nose, right? We want good for every cell of this one body, you know, and no part is left out. No part is left out. But unfortunately, you know, many people in this world are not yet in that state of oneness, and rather they feel separation, you know. And when we are feeling separation, that's when we feel fear of other, right? There's a fear of other, and there's a sense that the other might be a threat. I was having lunch with my dear friend Jeffrey the other day, and he shared a beautiful teaching from the Buddha that I hadn't heard, that the Buddha said that all suffering is due to duality. All suffering is due to dualism or feeling separation. And I really think that's very true. I think I wrote something that in a song, something like that in a song, many songs. But when we're in dualism, you know, loving the other, like say the other race or the other sexual orientation or the other that has different politics or the other that has different views than ours, well, that can feel challenging, you know? And I think sometimes we feel like we feel oneness, but our oneness is actually limited. It's a oneness with our circle, but not with those other guys, right? So when that is our idea of unity, it's limited. You know, it's the same as our idea of love when it's love that's conditional, right? It's limited. And so our journey is to become unlimited in our feelings and our beings and our experience of who we are, you know, so that we get to where we truly feel and experience the oneness with nothing excluded, right? You know, and I find in life that our best teachers are those who we are determined to love, even though we don't have the same views with. We might, you know, we might disagree vehemently, right? Those are the best teachers for us as far as growing our capacity to love unconditionally. So, what is the antidote to duality, right? That does cause suffering. There's a wonderful story I read about the astronaut Rusty Schweickart. He was up in space. He was in an Apollo capsule, and he was high above the Earth, and he had to go outside the capsule to do something. And he was temporarily stranded outside there. It wasn't like a scary thing. He knew he would get back in. But he just took the time to just float out there in space, and he's high above the earth, and there's this complete silence, like silence he had never known. And, you know, he'd been like a typical macho fighter pilot, but he had this transcendent experience that blasted his mind open to a greater reality. He was looking back at the earth, which he described as a shining gem against a totally black backdrop. And he was so overcome. He was so overcome. He just wanted to hug and kiss that gem like a mother does her firstborn child. And the political divisions, on our planet that meant so much to him before he entered space, they faded away entirely. He said the rivers didn't seem to pay attention to them, and the clouds didn't stop at the border between Russia and Europe, and that the ocean served communist and non-communist worlds indiscriminately. And so Schweikart saw something that he had never seen, and that was that there are no nations. There is the one earth and its people, the one earth and its people. And I just love that story. Like when you read what he wrote, you can feel his state of consciousness. He transcended duality. He was in that unitive state. We call our spiritual center unity. We are seeking that unitive state. We are seeking to live in that. And I really feel like folks need to be reminded of that view that Schweikart saw every day. One earth, one people, one world. Because, it asks us to stop for one moment and stop propping up our divisive thoughts about them and us, right? And wake up to true oneness. Because when we do, we care about all people as if they are part of our own body, including those folks that are fleeing violence at the borders, right? Including those folks that are a different race, those folks that have a different orientation, those folks that don't have the same politics that we do. The common good means we all matter. We all matter. And I find Jesus's teachings, I always turn to Jesus for the teachings on love and oneness. He has the best, I feel like. And this one I love when he said, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me." And they didn't really understand, his disciples, what he meant, because they hadn't done all those things specifically for him, right? So they asked, well, when was it that we fed you or welcomed you? When was it, that we gave you clothes or took care of you when you were sick or visited you in prison? And he said, truly, truly, I tell you that just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me. You could have said, who are members of my body, you did it to me. I love that teaching. For me, I'm really close to my brothers. Got a big brother and a little brother. And I love them so much. I would do anything for them at any time, no matter what, to help them. And so I've always felt like if I could feel that same love that I feel for them, for every man and every woman, for every human, well, I would definitely be a saint, But that's the teaching, that's the aspiration that all the great masters ask us to aspire to. That is what it is to love your neighbor as yourself. I always wonder what Jesus would do, right? What would he say to a politician right now that said, we don't want those folks at the border, send them back, I think Jesus would say, I am they. I am they. What about those homeless that we don't want in our town? He'd say, I am they. So it's so important to examine and see if we have a desire for the common good and how big that circle is. Because it seems to me it could always expand, and that it's a daily practice to expand it. It sometimes tends to contract because of the separation energy on the planet. And then we have to just keep opening back up opening that heart back up, opening back up. Okay, something made us close, something made us protect. Open back up, right? That's the practice, you know, to live with an open heart. In my opinion, the healthiest relationships thrive because both people care very much about the good and the well being of the other, right? And it's the same in the Sangha, it's the same in spiritual community, caring about the good of the whole, the good of every cell in that body, versus being focused on a personal agenda that maybe isn't what's best for everyone. Our healthiest societies are the ones where the best for the most people is what goes, right? Jesus offered another great teaching on the common good with the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know it, but I just think it's so good to consider. It was such a great teaching. So he was asked by a lawyer who was skeptical about the love your neighbor as yourself thing. He says, "What do you mean, love your neighbor as yourself?" And so Jesus told a story. He said, "Okay, well, there was this man. He went from Jerusalem to Jericho, and on his journey, he was attacked by a gang of robbers. And they took everything, even his clothes, and they beat him and they left him for dead. And a priest came by and passed by and saw the man, but he just walked around one side and he didn't stop and help. And then a little later, a Levite came up and saw him, but he didn't help. He passed by on the other side. But then a Samaritan came by and he saw the man and he took pity on him. And so this kind man cleaned him up. He bandaged his wounds. He put him on his donkey and he took him to an inn where he could rest, where he could heal. And he even stayed at the inn for an extra day to help care for this man. And then he told the innkeeper, "Please let him stay until he's healed. And when I come back through in a week, I will pay for whatever the amount is." So Jesus tells this story. And then, he says, "So who was the neighbor? Was it the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan?" And the lawyer answered, "Well, it was the Samaritan." And then Jesus said, "Go and do likewise. Go and do likewise." Such a powerful teaching story, right? It's good to remember that he didn't say, do likewise if they fit your idea of worthy, right? If they're worthy, do likewise. He said, just go and do likewise, right? So it's a teaching on expanding into the common good and the good for all, and wanting that good for all versus just wanting it for a selective group. I love how the common good is described. I've been reading this book called The Common Good by Robert Reich, and he describes it as being more inclined by the habits of the heart versus the ego, right? The habits of helping each other versus self-interest. And it's like this common sense inner compass that leads us to the right and decent thing to say or to write or way to be, right? I was thinking of that last scene in It's a Wonderful Life. I watch that every year. When George Bailey, remember Jimmy Stewart played George Bailey, and he's at his wit's end, right? He has a bank and he's all out of money, and he's not sure he should even go on living. And as his bank's about to go under, he has this huge transformative experience because the whole community comes together, all his neighbors, and they help him out. And he realizes he can count on his neighbors because they'd always counted on him. And they all realize that they're bound together in the common good. And we love that story. We love that scene where they're all there together and there's so much love and everyone's all teary-eyed, because our hearts know there's something so right about that, about living that way, where we focus on the common good. I want to say I was touched by what a lot of you wrote in the recent survey, although there were a few not so kind comments, which were good chances for me to practice equanimity. But one person in particular faulted me for being politically correct, and I've been called many things, but I had never been called that. So I had to do some research on what that even meant. And I did some research, and Wikipedia, good old Wikipedia, describes political correctness as using language or measures that are intended to avoid offense or disadvantage to members of particular groups in society. And so, reading that, I thought, okay, well, I can agree. I don't want to offend or disadvantage or marginalize socially disadvantaged people. I would rather treat them with equal respect and dignity and loving kindness. So I suppose I'm guilty as charged because I very much value inclusiveness and not being offensive. I've always loved that scripture on love from 1 Corinthians. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not boastful or rude, not offensive, right? So I want to live that. I want to live that. And again, Jesus being the great teacher of love and unity, he said that every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand. Those are cautionary words for us in this moment in time, that united we stand, right? The oneness song we sing, it's a call for inclusiveness, right? So as I was saying, I recently finished an insightful book. It's a study in political science called The Common Good by Robert Reich. And in his book, he describes how he was 14 years old when John F. Kennedy, he was there when John F. Kennedy said those words, to ask not what America can do for us, but what we can do for America. And, that quote is quoted so often because it's really a focus on unity. It's a focus on the common good and how we might contribute to that. And John F. Kennedy was asking us to be civil. He was asking us to be civilized to one another. So I looked up civil, and that is defined as a sense of our connectedness to each other and to our ideals. I love that. Civil is, and civilization is a sense of our connectedness to each other and to our ideals. So Robert describes how an aspect of our current challenge with the divisiveness in our country is partly due to separate groups relying on their separate worlds, their separate sources of news. And unfortunately, there's a lot of folks that want to further divisions. Their intention and their desire is not so much to create unity and healing. But I read this, I've been into history more in the last few years, and I read this quote from John Winthrop. He was the first elected governor of our country in Massachusetts colony back in 1630. And he had a vision. He had a vision of how we might live back there in what was, brand new, what they called America back then. He said, we must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our community as members of the same body. Our community as members of the same body. There it is. I think he was a minister as well as a governor. So I had a really powerful Good Samaritan experience that I want to share with you. It happened like when I first moved to Oroville. I took my first position as minister of Oroville. I'd only been there for a week. I was house sitting at the treasurer's house. And one night, it was getting dark, and I just stepped outside for a minute to grab a towel that I left outside on a chair, and I locked myself out of the house accidentally. The front door was one of those doors that lock automatically. And so there I was outside. It was getting dark. The whole house was locked. I was in a completely strange, in the country neighborhood. I didn't know a soul. And my phone and my keys were inside. And the closest place was about 2 miles, the 7-Eleven about 2 miles down a dark highway. And so while I was thinking about what am I going to do? Like, I'm freaking out. It's Saturday night. I have Sunday service the next morning, right? So this car pulls up across the street. And I can see, it's not quite dark, and I can see it's a young Hispanic woman. And I walk over across the street and I say hi, and I tell her I've locked myself out of my house. And, she's asking, is there any windows open? And I said, actually, there is a window above the bathtub, but it's really narrow and I don't think I can fit through. And so she's concerned about me and she's very friendly and I'm so relieved. And she walks with me back over to the house and we look at that window and she goes, I can get through that. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm a pretty good window climber. I've climbed through quite a few windows. And we're about the same size, but I trust her confidence. So I give her a lift up with my hand and she gets up to the window and she gets the screen off. And sure enough, she gets her little flexible body through that window and goes through the house and comes to the front door and lets me in. And I couldn't help myself. I just grabbed her and hugged her, and, she was surprised. She was laughing. And I just couldn't stop thanking her profusely. And the funny thing about this whole experience was I was speaking the next morning on the Good Samaritan. And it was like Spirit sent me the perfect experience, the perfect story to share, which here I am. I'm still sharing years later. So, our finest moments, the moments we talk about years later, are when we help each other or when someone helps us that absolutely did not need to. It's somebody that's a stranger, but they help us anyway. And this woman, she didn't see otherness in me. She was just helping a neighbor. She could have been afraid of me. I'm a different race, and she probably had plenty of people who look like me, not wanting to help her. But the innate goodness in her won over those dividing lines. And when that happens, I feel like every angel in every realm celebrates that goodness overcoming division. But it is often fear, and sometimes it's entitlement, that we're not even aware that we have, that tends to want to exclude and not include the others, right? But if we say we're about unity and we exclude, those that aren't in our circle, we're really not about unity, right? So we want to shine a light on that. We want to be compassionate for ourselves, but we want to shine a light on, what divides and separates in us and uproot that. The Buddhist Dhammapada, their holy scripture says, happy is the unity of the Sangha. Happy is the discipline of the united ones. That's what it is to be noble, is to be a united one that wants to unite. So the burning question, for our times, for each one of us, really in our personal life and in our society, is how does peace triumph over discord? How does unity triumph over divisiveness? How does love triumph over, contempt, right? I think one of the biggest challenges, and I mentioned it just slightly earlier, is that, truth has become optional in some ways. We need a truth that we all agree upon, an objective, factual truth that we agree upon. Robert talks about this. One of his best chapters is called Resurrecting Truth. And he says that reviving the common good depends on each of us taking responsibility for finding, sharing, and insisting upon public truth. He says it's the civic responsibility of all of us to check the facts we read or hear, to find and depend upon reliable sources, to share the truth with others, and hold accountable those who lie to us or suppress the truth. And that's because without a shared truth, democratic deliberation is impossible. Those are Robert's words. And I have to agree, I agree with him. He says that everyone is, of course, entitled to their opinions. We all are entitled to our opinions, but not our own facts, right? And so he says we have a responsibility to educate ourselves and others about how to find the truth, how to assess the news we receive thoughtfully and critically. And I have to say, I'm really hopeful for our young people. I just, right across the street, they had a high school graduation, and I watched it, and I was so inspired by these young people coming up and their wisdom, and just feeling this real heart desire that they thrive. Um, but it's important they have civic education to learn to value truth, to have that passion for thinking critically and vetting sources of information so they can differentiate fact from fiction. I feel like we need good leaders who truly care about the common good, right? Who value truth and integrity as well as civility, right? So we need to value truth based on facts and logic. And most of all, we need to remember we're all in this together, and that united we stand, united we thrive. So in closing, I'd love to share a quote. I love this quote. It's always been one of my favorites from the Indian yogi Muktananda. He said, through intense, deep meditation, you reach a state that is beyond thought, beyond change, beyond imagination, beyond differences and duality. Once you can stay in that state for a while and come out of it without losing any of it, then the inner divine love will begin to pour through you. You will not see people as different, separate individuals. You will see your own self in everyone around you. Then the flow of love from within you will be constant and unbroken. So may we see our own self in everyone, and may love flow from us like a river of melting snow from within each of us. And may all beings be at peace and live in unity. May it be, and so it is. Om Shanti, Om Peace. Thank you.
Very inspiring. Thank you so much, Kathy. Wonderful. Now we'd like to see who has been listening and watching on Zoom. If Glenn might be able to push that magic button so we can see the gallery view. Kim does it. Sorry, Kim.